Hello everybody, I hope you're keeping safe and well. I just wanted to pop on here and talk to you a little bit about the use of textures and patterns in drawings and how they can really give a sense of reality and a real sort of feel and an interest which you can't get if you don't really use them. So creating a sense of touch and using mark making to do that is really quite important in recording our kind of what's around us. And when you start looking, there are textures and patterns everywhere in the landscape, on materials, in clothing, throughout your house. And it's really worth just kind of studying those really and creating some sort of shorthand notions for some of them. And you can almost create yourself a little library, and I'll show you how to do that in a while. But what I wanted to show you first of all is really how I use textures and patterns in my drawings. So I'm going to take you through just a few examples in my sketchbook. So this first one here is a couple of old cottages and they have some really interesting planting in front of them. Hopefully you can see that I've used textures to create this sort of sense of the roofscape, so that the slate tiles on the roof. I've used them to show the brickwork here. I've used them to denote a variety of different planting, and by varying the type of textures that I draw, be it big loopy leaves or big sort of scallopy angled leaves or little tiny dots, I'm creating a sort of a sense of the feel of these different plants and the texture of them, which really adds interest to the drawing. And you can see here the sort of like different sort of linear lines which are creating the sort of grassy plants, and then this here is the grooves on the planting pot. So you can see that even in black and white, and particularly in black and white actually, by using this sort of textural approach where you show the different textures, you can really build up interest and dynamic within the drawing. So if I move on to another one, this one is a black and white one again, and this is interesting because here you can see that I'm using it to denote some of the patterning on the clothing, and so there's the spots here on this lady's jumper, and then the stripiness of the hat. And then what is quite interesting in this drawing, and what is a really useful way of using texture, is that you can use texture to denote the darkness and lightness, the tonal values, if you like. And so this is a kind of a chimney pot in this drawing, and by using the cross hatching, I'm kind of creating this mid-tone, and by using it a really dark pen, obviously that's the dark tone, and I'm using it again in the doorway here. So that's another way in which you can use textures and hatching to actually give you that sort of sense of the darks and the lights. And another way of using, and I'll just flick on to another drawing here, is that you can use it to create the textures to create depth in the drawing. Ignore the colour because that kind of confuses the issue, but if you look at this tree in the foreground, it's particularly in the foreground, and you can tell that because there's a lot of detail to it, and that detail is created by using the textures. So I've got the textures here of the bark, which gives you a real sort of sense of the feel of that bark, and then I've got all of the dots and things of the leaves, which is another texture. But then if you can see at the base of the tree here, I've got all of these round tiny little blobs, which are the sort of stones and giving that kind of roughness at the ground level. And then hatching here, which denotes the grilling and griddle of the surrounding paving. So you can see that by using textures in this way, I'm creating that depth because there's lots of texture in the foreground, and as you get further back you see less texture, or less detail I should say. Now I mentioned to you, so that's enough of giving you examples through my sketchbook. I wanted to just give you a couple more examples which are really lovely ones actually. This one here has come from a textbook, and I'm sorry but I don't know what the book is because the book is in my studio and I can't get to my studio at the moment very readily because I'm at home. But this is really lovely. It's a still life with lots of different fabrics, and you can see how you can create with the different textural effects that you're creating here, the person has created here, with the different types of material they're using for this mark making, from really strong dark lines to sort of soft pencily lines of the wood to the grid-like ones of this fabric here, and the sort of more frottly marks here. You can see how texture can be used to really great effect, and you can vary that depending on how much you want to go at it in your drawing, really. But I thought it was worth showing you that because that's all materials. And then something I've created because I'm particularly interested in landscapes here, which is worth just having a look at. Can you see all of the different textures in the landscape here? So you can see how you could create those in your drawings, from the stone wall effect to the striations of the metal, to the planting, to the wood, to the brickwork. So there's all of these things here and you can capture that in your drawings through the way in which you draw things. So that's another really lovely example. And one final example, which has got a lot of texture on it, is this here. And this is actually a planting bed in, actually it's in Sheffield Botanical Gardens, but that's not kind of relevant. But you can see how by using the different textures, you can create all sorts of effects of the different type of planting in this quite simply. And also use it, as we've talked before, to create that sense of tonal value, and also to create a sense of the 3D. The 3D of the plants in these is created through the use of the textures to create that effect. And if you can see there, from going to the very dark shadow to the light side, and by doing that sort of gradual variation of the texture, you create that sense of the third dimension. And I've obviously used it in the windows here as hatching again, and on the roofscape here. So quite a lot of texture again in that drawing. So what I wanted to now talk to you about is how that you can use, how you can create a little sort of library for yourself, if you like. So this is just an example, and all I do is, if I'm wanting to sort of practice textures that I then might use in drawings, I just kind of create myself these grids of squares, 2 inches by 2 inches, and I practice the particular texture. Now here, this is a really useful one. This could be used for tonal value in a very simple way. I use it quite a lot on the roofs to create that feeling of the tiles. This could be planting or ground cover planting. This could be windows or panes, window panes. I was drawing something yesterday actually, and this could be the planting of a particular planting with very small leaves. This is clearly brickwork. So all manner of things there, and you can just practice those and then drop them into your drawings as you will. What I wanted to do now is just very briefly to show you how I do that, and I've got some examples of some different things here which I can use. So this very housey and cleany is one of those things that you use to scour the pans with. I've got my wonderful teddy bear here, Grayson, whose strapline is every cloud has a silver lining, so I thought that was quite appropriate for these times. And then I've got a dishcloth here, which you can see has quite an interesting texture and also pattern. So texture and pattern kind of go hand in hand together. They're not the same thing, but hopefully you can see there's a texture on this cloth and there's also a pattern, so that's quite helpful. What I thought I would do is actually just get some paper and show you how I do these types of drawings. But I won't draw the whole object. What I will do is show you how I create those little kind of grids, if you like. So what I do is, in my sketchbook or wherever, I just create freehand these small squares. Hope you can see that. So if I do just 3 for now. And of course, depending on what you're drawing, it's a bit like the mark making we were talking about before. You need to practice how you would actually create that texture, and you might have to press hard or press quite lightly, and you might need to use different materials, different types of pens or pencils, depending on the effect you want to create. So what I'm going to do here is I'll start with Grayson, and of course with Grayson, if you were drawing him, you'd have to pay particular attention to how the different sort of hairs were falling, so that would kind of create the three-dimensional effect and also the reality of that sort of fluffiness, if you like. I'm not going to use a pen because that won't work really very well with that fluffiness, but I'm going to use just a graphite stick here and show you how I would use it in these boxes. And of course I'm not going to show sort of the different patterning in terms of how it's falling, because it depends on what the limb is and where it is. So I'm just going to try and create the overall kind of hair effect, if you like. And so I'm just sort of looking at it as I go, and I'm just sort of seeing how I can kind of build that effect up. And it's quite sort of long and sort of straggly, and that's what I'm trying to kind of create in the texture, really. So you get that kind of feel of his hair, or of his kind of fluffy coat. And as I say, I'm doing it in different directions, but you'd have to sort of follow whatever the direction was of the limb if you were drawing it in on an actual drawing of him. And all I'm trying to do is to give that sense of his sort of fluffiness. So by practicing in these sorts of squares, it just really helps you get a sort of sense of A, how to simplify, and B, what sort of marks you need to create and how hard you want. And I'm not pressing very hard because it's got a kind of a fluffiness to it, and if I press too hard, I'm going to get too much of a harsh kind of mark, really. Does that make sense? So anyway, that's kind of Grayson, if you like. That's his kind of fluffiness. I'm trying to kind of create that feel of the fluffiness there. And I suppose you could do it with pen if you were kind of quite gentle with it, but it just seems to lend itself to a softer sort of tool, really. So that's Grayson. Now if I then go onto this, I'm not going to draw the circle. So of course, it's a bit like Grayson, depending on the angle of the object. If you're drawing the object with a texture on it, then it will be different to how you're drawing it in the boxes, because obviously that goes in a circle, and depending on where it is and how the light's hitting it, it looks different. But if I'm just trying to sort of simplify, all that is really is a lot of very sort of loopy loops. So this is how I would practice it in the squares, and it's obviously not a square. I'm just stylizing to get a sense of how I would represent the texture. The square is not relevant, it's just something so that I can provide a little boundary so I can kind of practice, really. And what I'm going to try and do is some of them, it's not all even, so I'm going to just try and practice that sometimes it's quite close together, and then as it goes around a corner or around a different bit of it, it's quite open. So I kind of am in this, I'm trying to get a sense of that non-uniformity, if you like. I mean, you don't have to go to that extent, because it, as I said, you are trying to sort of simplify it, but also not making it too perfect, because these things never are perfect. So it's just trying to sort of give you that effect, really. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So I'll kind of whiz through this because it's just... And the more you practice, the kind of more you kind of get to a style of it. Anyway, so the third and final one is this one, really. And when I'm starting to look at this, I can see, and I'm going to use the pen, but I can see that there are these stripes, so I might just put those in. But I'm obviously not using colour, so that they kind of won't necessarily show up. But what is very interesting with this is it's this sort of grid that I'm trying to create with this. So all I'm going to do, but this is kind of useful in itself, is a kind of creating these little squares. It's easier if you just do this as a grid. So it's about looking carefully at what you're drawing, seeing its uniformity and its idiosyncrasies, and then just trying to capture those and stylize them to simplify. You don't want to be doing the whole. But if I was doing this and I wasn't short on time, I would show the whole thing. Anyway, I hope that's been useful. So hopefully now you will incorporate some textures and patterns into your drawings to add interest and variety. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.